Ah, fantastic. Okay, right. Well, welcome back. Thank you once again for attending, and hopefully we'll get through Constitution today. I think we should complete Constitution today because we did quite a lot last lesson, and actually most of the essays I'm predicting, at least for EdExcel, have really been covered in the last few essays we covered last lesson. So actually, this essay did come up last year, but I thought it'd be worth sharing the essay with you, only because I think it's like a staple essay, and a lot of the detail in this essay you'll be able to apply in many various constitution essays. So it's probably worth knowing the content for this. But I would imagine your teachers have already set you a codified versus uncodified constitution essay, because that's the basic essay, right? And it came up last year, as I said, as a question, and students they loved it because we did so much work on this essay. So they were pretty confident in answering the in answering that essay. Do you guys have any questions before we begin? By the way, everyone okay? Everyone doing good? How's school going? I hope you guys are on track with your politics. Everything going good? Thumbs up. Fantastic. That's good to hear. Brilliant. Okay. Right. So evaluate the view that there are more advantages to having a codified constitution than remaining with an uncodified constitution. So it's a simple essay on codification versus uncodification. What's better? As you know, we have an uncodified constitution in the UK. So the British constitution is uncodified, and neither is it entrenched, which is a subdivision, of course. You got codification and then you got entrenchment. So we neither have codification or entrenchment. And so that basically means that there is no separate constitutional law. And whoever's drawn on my screen, not draw my screen, rub it out. You've just drawn on the right hand side of my screen. But yeah, thank you very much. I know I should. There is a way to allow you to have your own individual sketch pad. I just haven't worked out how to do that. If someone works that out, tell me one day, how do you do that? Because of course that's quite a useful tool to have. But oh, there is something. I've just pressed annotate, and some bar has come up. Anyway, I'll work that out. I think I'm probably gonna have to watch a tutorial on it. And so, yeah, okay. So codified versus uncodified constitutions. Right, let's go through an introduction. So we have an uncodified constitution in the UK, meaning ultimate sovereignty lies in Parliament, and they can override any decisions. I suppose we should make that a bit more stronger. They can override any legislation, right? So remember, parliamentary sovereignty means that no parliament is bound by a decision of a previous parliament. This is beneficial due to the flexibility, ability to meet current demands, and accountability of MPs. Still, it can also be seen as damaging, as it means that government has the power to make decisions which could harm our rights. Ultimately, there is not a massive demand to have a codified constitution, and an uncodified constitution fundamentally gives the government flexibility, which is in the interests of the public. So my ultimate judgment is that it's probably better to stay with an uncodified constitution than to move to a codified constitution. To be honest, there's no right answer to this. You could argue the other side, and there are pretty strong arguments to say that codification is a good idea over uncodified constitutions. So here are my three sections. The first section is on rights. A codified constitution protects rights. The second section is it will place powers in the hands of an impartial judiciary. So a codified constitution will give a lot of power to judges who are impartial. At the moment, judges rank second or third even. So you've got government, parliament, and then judges. Judges are not really equal, like in the American system, to the executive or to the to parliament. So what we have is we've got a a system which is very asymmetrical when it comes to powers. So a codified constitution would give judges real equal powers to government and to parliament. And lastly, it will clarify the roles and powers of the prime minister and executive and remove unwritten conventions. So the role of the prime minister will be clarified by all of this, right? Okay, so let's look at the codified constitution and how it protects rights. Claire, the intro is different to the sections. Are they different to the sections? Wait a minute. Yes, it is. Yes, you're right. You know what I did? I probably nicked this intro of someone, and then I decided, well, this is what I do all the time, Charles. I called you Claire. I don't know why I called you Claire. This is what I do all the time, Charles. I put down an introduction, and then when I'm doing my slides, I realize actually that probably is a bit too difficult. And so if I end up changing it, and then I end up not changing the introduction. So well spotted, Charles. But that's true. Right. A codified constitution protects rights. So a codified constitution normally entrenches rights, such as a Bill of Rights in the United States. At the moment, parliamentary sovereignty means that rights are subject to the will of Parliament. You get a law, the law can change anytime, and all you need is a majority to overturn rights. So, for example, in 2023, the then Justice Secretary Dominic Raab, he called for repealing probably one of the most important bits of legislation we've had, repealing the Human Rights Act, right? So that was something that he introduced, and he could do that. He could introduce it. Why? Because parliaments are not bound by the legislation passed by previous parliaments. Why did he want to do that? Well, particularly he disliked Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to a family life. Now, you would ask yourself a question: why would the Conservatives have a problem with a right to a family life? Because Conservatives are all about family, right? Well, the answer to that is 70% of foreign criminals who lodge deportation appeals. So these are people who come to Britain, they're foreigners, they come to Britain and they commit a crime. And so when they commit a crime, they may go to prison or they may get a fine. And now the Home Secretary wants to get rid of them. They've committed a crime. You need to now leave the country. They lodge deportation appeals under this clause of a family life. So let me put it in another way. What they argue is, if you send me back to my home country, I'm going to be deprived of a family life because I've got a child in this country, or I've got a wife or a husband in this country. And so by arguing that, some of them, not all of them, some foreign criminals who commit a crime are allowed to stay in the country because they can say our human rights have been infringed. Now, by the way, you may think that's a pretty horrible thing, right? If they're a foreigner, they've committed a crime. But of course, crimes are on a spectrum. Someone may commit a crime which is pretty on the soft end of the spectrum. Someone may commit, a victimless crime, and someone may commit a victim crime. These are very broad categories, or it is a very broad category. But nevertheless, he wanted to get rid of the Human Rights Act because he disagrees with the clause which gives everyone the right to a family life for that reason. Now, in an essay, all you have to say is the government wanted to get rid of the Human Rights Act because they disliked the Article 8 of the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which gave everyone a right to a family life, full stop. They disagreed with this because 70% of foreign criminals who lodge deportation appeals do so using this clause, right? That's all you have to write in an essay. And that's a really good specific evidence that is being used. Hope you're good with that. I'm going into a lot of specifics here, and you don't really need these specifics, partly because the government did overturn that. They're no longer going to get rid of the Human Rights Act, right? So, it was the case for a long time. They wanted to get rid of it. Now they've basically declared they're not going to do that. And it was actually Rishi Sunak who last year said that it's no longer his concern. trust me when I say that it may come back, and it may come back in their manifesto. And the only reason why it will come back in their manifesto is because they know it's a weak thing. The conservative right, the conservative membership do not like the Human Rights Act, partly because the tabloid press, the Daily Mail and the Sun, they spend every day attacking the Human Rights Act for being, a charter for victims, a charter for criminals and terrorists. In fact, that's what David Cameron called it. David Cameron called the Human Rights Act a charter for criminals and terrorists. Now, the point being made there is so I'm not going to go through all of these, but getting rid of these rights would just require a simple majority in Parliament, and that's it. And they can overturn what is nearly 2 decades, not nearly 1.5 decades of human rights law would be overturned by a simple act of Parliament. They were wishing to replace the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights, right? And this British Bill of Rights would be very specific about, which would be very specific to British rights. Don't ask me what that means. What are British rights and what are human rights? I'm not sure. But what they really wanted to do is make it harder to interpret the Human Rights Act. So they wanted to confine judges, because at the moment, when you say a right to a family life, that allows for a lot of interpretation, right? And so judges have a right then to interpret a very broad clause into lots and lots of case law, we call it, lots and lots of specific law. What he was saying here, the Home Secretary or the Justice Secretary Dominic Raab was saying, is he's going to make it very specific. So, for example, he may have written in that Bill of Rights a right to a family life if you are a British citizen and you do not commit a crime. So it's been very specific. So if you do commit a crime, then you no longer have a right to a family life, for example. I hope you get that point. So they wanted to be far more specific. Now, the other thing to say is that the government can overturn our rights with a simple statute law. I'm not sure who's texting me. I don't know if you can hear that. Can you hear that? Someone's texting me. Lots and lots of. Oh, okay. No worries. Excellent. Right. So a right to. Yeah. Okay. There are other. I'm going to put this in silent. Sorry. So can they overturn now or only with a codified constitution? They could overturn anything because there's no codified constitution here. They could turn any right-based law by simply passing a majority, because there's actually nothing, there's no real constitutional law except the law which we designate as constitutional law. We call the Human Rights Act constitutional law because it sort of fits the Constitution. That's it, right? We don't really have a set of laws that are constitutional laws, because we're not like America, which has, a constitution, and those laws are changed by extraordinary special measures. We don't have that at all. So just to remind you, you've had a number of acts that have been passed that really fundamentally overturn our rights. The Nationalities and Borders Act, for example. If you remember that act was the act that allows the government to take away our passports if you have the potential to become a citizen of another country. So to put it crudely, if you are white British, it's not likely, unless you're Irish or you're Polish or something, but you're unlikely to have a second potential citizenship. If you are Asian or Black British, there is every likelihood that you could potentially get a citizenship of Jamaica or citizenship of Bangladesh. And because of that, if they deem you to be a terrorist or a terrorist suspect, they can take away your passport. In other words, you can't return back to Britain. And they've made that so easy to do. It just requires the Home Secretary to make that decision. So, you're relying on the Home Secretary to have a claim of to be just. And as we've realized, most Home Secretaries in the past X number of years, 13, 14 years, have actually been pretty horrible, right? Just think about Priti Patel. Just think about Suella Braverman. Given the chance, given these ministers immense powers, they're able to do a great amount of damage. Anyway, you can read through this. There was also the Police Crime in Sentencing and Courts Act, and that will ban noisy protests. And it will, if you damage a memorial, for example, a statue, you could get up to 10 years in prison. Now that's pretty shocking. I mean, we complain about the Russians and how they arrest people who demonstrate, who protest against the Putin government, right? And quite rightly. But we have here a British government that, in effect, could imprison you if you spray paint a memorial for up to 10 years. And that's a pretty harsh, I think that's a very harsh measure. Okay. And there are all sorts of other things that they've passed. I'm not going to go through this slide because it's overkill. I may go for it tomorrow. So if just to remind you, I'm doing a YouTube live tomorrow where I will go through at 7. I'm going to do it at 7:30. It gives me a little bit more time. So YouTube live tomorrow where I'm going to go through examples. So I may go through this particular example tomorrow. But to be honest, you've got enough to write an entire paragraph or half a paragraph already. So what's a counter to this argument? Well, the counter is that in an uncodified constitution actually gives you flexibility regarding your rights. It's more beneficial because it gives the government the power to respond to current issues. So, for example, the classic example, which it's still worth using, after the Dunblane massacre, the school shooting, the government outlawed handguns within a week. In the United States, after countless amounts of shootings, even the most modest measures to the Second Amendment, modest measures to gun ownership have not been carried because the Constitution does not allow, no Constitution allows you to carry guns, right? I mean, in New York, they tried to overturn, they tried to pass a law which meant that if you carried a weapon, you could only carry that weapon. You couldn't carry it on the streets. You could only carry it in a safe place. So either it's like a car glove compartment, which is locked, or in your home. A very modest measure, like you couldn't carry it concealed under your jacket. And the Supreme Court overturned it and said that contradicts the Second Amendment of the Constitution. So in New York, again, you're allowed to carry a gun around everywhere you go, right? That's pretty horrific. In the UK, it took a week to get rid of handguns. Now you hardly ever hear, unless it's an illegal handgun, you actually hardly ever hear of a handgun crime, right? And that speaks volumes, I think. Okay. When social attitudes change, civil marriages were introduced. Governments have enough checks. The media and the House of Lords and select committees are all checks on government, because the argument goes, if you don't have a codified constitution, then you don't have accountability. Well, maybe there are enough levers of accountability. The House of Lords. In America, for example, abortion, Charles has just mentioned it, in a US politics essay, could a comparison of Roe v. Wade be used? Yes, versus the Abortion Act here in the UK. Fantastic. And that's a point I've just made here. Abortion rights. At the moment, abortion rights have almost become depoliticized in the UK. Like you don't have lots of political debates about abortion here, because it's settled. Whereas in the United States, it's a constant debate. And of course, the United States, it was a constitutional debate because Roe v. Wade, which was passed in 1973, Roe v. Wade was the idea of the Supreme Court, or Supreme Court judgment, which stated that the American Constitution has in effect allowed abortion. And what happened a couple of years ago when Roe v. Wade was repealed was that the Supreme Court said, actually, you're wrong. The American Constitution says nothing about abortion. And so abortion is no longer a federal right. It's up to the individual states. In the UK, we don't have that. And we don't have that simply because almost the debate has been depoliticized. There is no debate now whether it's conservatives or Lib Dems or Labour, no one really debates it anymore because it's sort of more settled. Um, Even when we talk about the Human Rights Act, we could argue, well, maybe, just maybe, there are aspects of the Human Rights Act that do need to be debated, right? Maybe, just maybe, it is wrong that the Human Rights Act gives so much license to criminals to use the Human Rights Act in a cynical way. If 70% of foreign born criminals are using the Human Rights Act to stay in the country, then maybe, just maybe, that requires change, and governments are in a respectable position to make that change. So as an interim judgment, you could say, although it could be argued that rights are protected, they are not guaranteed, and there is a need to defend hard-won rights from governments that want to undermine them. So you could argue that. I'm actually going against my original judgment here as well. You could argue that, or you could argue the opposite. You could say that on balance, the flexibility that the government has is probably better. I mean, what do you guys think? I'm sure you've had debates about this in class. What's your take on this? Do you think that it's that a codified constitution is better? I mean, specific to this point, don't give me the sort of the general argument. Specific to the point about rights, is it better to have or not to have? Yeah. Selective codification of certain part acts. Yeah, Aisha, I think that's a really nuanced argument, right? Over uncodified, worse for rights, better overall. Yeah. 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 Rights are constantly woven in flexibility is essential, Sky. Yeah. The wisdom of Sky comes through once again. Leah, not to have, don't want to give the far right a foundation to stand on. Yeah, Leah, explain that. That's an interesting point because, but surely the far right would have, I mean, if you imagine if the far right came to government, I mean, that's not inconceivable now that you've now got, the Conservative Party that's lurching to the far right, right? So imagine if the far right did come to government, they would be able to commit enough damage to rights, wouldn't they? Because they would have to get rid of anything. Regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump has been not been able to do very much in terms of eroding rights because of the US constitutions. And you've made that point, Leah. Like in the US, they use the constitution as a cultural stand-in for absolutely everything. Yeah. Niniola, my apologies. Nin, is that your surname, or have you just put that down? Uh, Niniola. That's a great surname if that's really your surname. Better to have, as it prevents irrational bills from being placed as society's been forever changed. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. It is your surname. So Niniola's surname is some fun. Some fun. So that's a great name. Um, uh, Ninola, do people say stuff about you? Sorry, Ninola, maybe you're tired of this, but in primary school, and now I'm not going to look like a primary school student because I'm like, I'm focusing on your surname. So it's a primary school student that's come out, I'm afraid. Sky, also, as seen in the USA, a written constitution can become a primary focus of attention rather than the rights themselves. Yeah, that's very true, Sky. Sky's point is, Sky, Sky, you're a keyboard warrior. So Sky's good point, very good point, is that the Constitution has become the focus rather than rights themselves. And Miss Somfun has told us that, yeah, people do constantly talk about her surname, including me on a call to 26 other people and countless other people who watch this later on online. So I'm sorry. It's my youth coming out. Okay, great. Right, excellent. So let's talk about the second point. I'll run through this quicker now. Judiciary will be strengthened. So the last few years have demonstrated that elected politicians can abuse their positions or undermine the constitution in return for being populist. The government's attempts to prorogue parliament in 2019 and blatant attempts to shut down scrutiny were successfully challenged in courts, right? So when the government tried to shut down Parliament under Boris Johnson in 2019, it was the Supreme Court who concluded that they had acted unlawfully. And the reason why the Supreme Court is important is judges have the security of tenure. They can't be removed. And that was solidified in the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, not six. That's my mistake. I think it's five. Yes, it's five, enabling them to make more rational decisions, right? So judges are not, cannot be sacked very easily. Politicians can't sack judges. Politicians, on the other hand, they're always looking to win elections. Imagine if the judiciary was heavily politicized and judges did not have that many powers. Imagine what the conservative government will be doing today in order to try to win a general election, right? You could imagine what they'd be doing today. In the US, judges are guardians of the Constitution. If a future government decided to change the UK radically, there are very few safeguards because judges just do not have that many powers in Britain. In most modern liberal democracies, the Supreme Court acts as a counterbalance. It's independent and impartial, and it acts as a counterbalance to the other two branches of state. So the analysis here is that you can link the judiciary being guardians of the Constitution to liberalism. Now, I'm going to say something quite important here about synopticity. Now, again, my apologies to AQA students because it's not quite like this for AQA, but for EdExcel students, and it's the vast majority of you, when you write a non-source 30 marker, so not a source 30 marker, a non-source 30 marker, so just that one question in section B, when you write an answer to that non-source 30 marker, you actually have to make synoptic links, right? Now, what is synopticity? Synopticity is a fancy word. Actually, it's a non-word, because every time I write synopticity in my Word documents, I always get those red squiggly lines. So it's not even a word. I don't know where this word comes from. I don't know what the etymology of this word is, right? But the exam would seem to like the word synopticity. Like if you were playing Scrabble today and you put synopticity down, you wouldn't get your extra, you wouldn't get, I mean, it's a fancy word, but you probably wouldn't get your marks for it. I may be mistaken. I mean, I'm just, I'm just sort of accepting what Word says. But if you are an EdExcel student anyway, synopticity is the following, right? So let me explain synopticity. In a component to non-source essay, so that's the 30-mark non-source essay, you have to make references back to UK politics or to the ideologies. In other words, to paper one, to component one. Now, what does that mean? That means in my books, and the exam would haven't quite said this, but this is how I interpret it. That means that in each paragraph, you've got to make some sort of explicit link to either democracy, parties, elections, voting behavior, conservatism, liberalism, socialism. So you've got to make some form of link. It can only be, it does only have to be one sentence. So you don't have to make a very big link with like a very long link. But I would say just 3 times in an essay, make sure you link back to your component one content. And so in this case, you could almost say that a codified constitution and a separation of powers where judges are strong, it accords with, it's in line with liberalism, right? And that's it. That's all you have to say. It's in line with liberalism. Right. AQA, Leah. AQA is quite different when it comes to synopticity. Leah, I'm going to have to come back to you on AQA because I've actually forgotten. It's been some time since I've remembered the AQA. So, Leah, as I said to you before, I'm going to spend a session probably with you guys on AQA. Oh, you're not an AQA. So why are you asking about AQA, Leah? If you're not AQA. If for EdExcel, you've got to link the component 2 to component 1. Oh, if you're asking, Do you have to link a component 1 to 2? No, you don't. So synopticity doesn't work the other way. You don't have to link a paper 1 to 2. You just have to link a paper 2 to 1, right? And you don't get synopticity in the ideas essay in paper 2. Neither do you get synopticity, or neither do you have to use synopticity in the source question. How does that all sound? Okay. Right. What about paper 3, Michaela? Yes, paper 3 does have synopticity, but it's a bit different in paper 3. For synopticity, there are two synoptic links in paper 3. I'm now talking about global politics, but I think this is the same. Well, certainly this is, I think paper 3 is really easy in EdExcel because in the essay questions, you've got two essay questions. Synopticity is simply making a link to other parts of the US or global course. So for example, in US, if there's a question on judiciary, or in global politics, if there's a question on globalization, you'd still have to make connections with power and development in global, or connections with the constitution in US. So in other words, you can't just write a standalone question. You've got to make links with other parts of the course, right? And then there's a synoptic link in that section B 12 marker. And in that 12 marker, you've got to make a link back to ideologies, at least for global politics. Sorry, for US politics, it's synoptic anyway, because you're making the UK US link, because the question in section B is about UK US, right? Yeah, anyway, don't worry about the US side. It's not that important. But in global politics, you've got to make a link back to ideologies in that 12 mark realism liberalism question. Anyway, I'm going off track. So judges, so back to this, judges are impartial, and that means they believe in the rule of law. Recent events have shown that we cannot trust politicians to uphold the rule of law. For example, over Iraq or over Partygate, politicians break the law. When they get a chance, they do wrong things. So do you really trust politicians, or would you rather have impartial judges guiding your system and balancing against politicians and what they do? Yeah, by the way, don't get too carried away with synopticity, because I've actually never heard an examiner talk about synopticity that explicitly. They're not really that concerned. No, they are concerned about it, but you do it anyway. Every time you write a component 2 question, it's very difficult to not talk about political parties, right? Because you're going to talk about conservatives, and you're going to talk about possibly ideology. You're going to talk about policies. So synopticity isn't really that deep, as you guys say on the streets. Yeah. What's you guys have got a problem with full stops. I've noticed that recently, that young people of your age, they don't like sending messages with full stops. Like if you put a full stop in a message, you're potentially, like, it's an injury that you're casting on the other person. Is that true? Like I'm just reading through the comments you've made here. Sky's comment does not have a full stop. Niola's comment does not have a full stop. Leah's comment does not have any full stops, even though she's given me 2 paragraphs. Sky's comment does not have a full stop again. Charles's comment doesn't have a full stop. Aisha's comment, what is it with you and full stops? Why don't you guys like full stops? What's going on here? Right? Full stops sound passive aggressive, says Amelia, without a full stop. How does it sound? Why? It's punctuation. How do you know when to take a pause? Nita, I think it's because of it being a Zoom and relatively informal. Okay, but you don't use full stops in any informal setting then. You don't say in like WhatsApp messages. Why? Why wouldn't you use a full stop? I always use full stops. I don't get it. Oh, goodness. All right. Should we carry on? Like, do you write emails with full stops? Okay, that's not, so WhatsApp messages, fine. But do you write emails with full stops? Are you not even putting full stops into emails because you don't want it to be passive aggressive? yeah, that doesn't make sense. Surely you have to write emails. I want to go through all my emails again that I've received from students. Trisha, only use full stops in formal writing, e.g., writing to teachers. Trisha, you've said that as if you're an authority. According to Trisha Roy, an authority on punctuation, an authority on British grammar, on English grammar. You only use full stops in informal writing, but that, you know, that's what you say, Trisha. I would say to you, I will contend, Your Honor, that full stops are widely used in all forms of content. So, like, I can't get it. I like, if you like now, okay, fine, you're writing a couple of words to me, but imagine if you wrote an entire paragraph about full stops. Wouldn't that just make, that would be quite dispiriting, I would imagine. Anyway, no more questions about full stops. It's just my fault. Right. Counter argument. Uncodified constitutions place the power in the hands of elected politicians, right? So when you've got an uncodified constitution, politicians have the power. And that's good because politicians are accountable to the people. Judges aren't accountable to the people. Judges, once they become judges, they remain judges for life. Politicians can be thrown out. They make the balance between rights and security because ultimately they know the political consequences, right? Judges don't have an eye on political consequences, so they may end up making reckless judgments. They're able to make democratic decisions that are held accountable at elections and through parliamentary committees. Judges have to be above that accountability, so there are few public mechanisms to hold judges to account. And would you want that? Do you want an American style system where judges have become highly politicized because judges are appointed by politicians, local and federal? Do you really want that? Or is it better to have a system where judges are aloof, but judges remain separate? Well, yes, as long as you've got politicians who are accountable to the people. At the moment, we do not have what we call judicial activism as an accusation that's made in the US Supreme Court. In the United States, there is an idea of judicial activism. The idea that judges have become politicized and they're doing things as if they're activists. In Britain, judges are above everything. They're above the fray. And you can link this synoptically to the conservative argument that it is better to keep something that works than to attempt to perfect it and create greater problems. If you believe in total democracy, then you should be electing judges. But the conservative argument is, well, if you really do that, you're going to destroy a system which is working. So sometimes it's better to go with the irrational than to go with the rational, because sometimes the irrational actually works out much better. And that is a better way for the system to work, right? I hope you get that synoptic link, but that's the counter to the second argument. And the third argument is that it clarifies the role of government. A codified constitution would clarify the role of government. It places into higher law the many conventions and prerogative powers that are ill-defined and subject to constant abuse. Charles, how would you suggest introducing a synoptic point? I noticed, Charles, that you did use a question mark there. And a question mark, it does stand in for a full stop as well, right? So if you have a question mark at the end of a statement, it is also a full stop. So I could say to you, Charles, why are you using a question mark if you're not being passive aggressive, right? What's going on here, Charles? But to answer your point, just say it. Like you could say something like, so for example, you could say, so if we go back, you could say something like, judges are above the fray. They're not accountable to voters. And that is very much a conservative argument, because conservatives believe that if something is not broken, even if it doesn't rationally make sense, because voting for judges may rationally make sense, but if it doesn't rationally make sense, it's still a good it's still better, right, than ruin and than destroying a system. Trisha, for paper 2 source questions, do you need a synoptic link? No, you don't. Yeah, so for Edexcel source questions, no need for synopticity, just for non-source questions. Charles, full stop, passive aggressive, question mark, exclamation, etc. connote a certain emotion or specific context. Again, Charles, that's your law, but you've given me a full stop. So, Charles, you've said full stops are passive aggressive, and then at the end of that statement, you've actually given me a full stop. I'm offended now, Charles. You've hurt my inner feelings. How am I ever going to survive this attack on my integrity? Because you've decided to unleash a full stop against me. You guys, in my day, we were tough. We were tough people on the streets. We used to go out, to the park, and I don't know where I'm going here, because going to the park doesn't sound very tough. We used to, I don't, anyway, forget it. Okay, so that's where we are, right? Thirdly, last point, clarifies the role of government. A codified constitution will clarify exactly what the role of government is, because it will place into higher law, into constitutional law, the many conventions and prerogative powers that are ill-defined. Now, we'll come back to this when we look at prime minister, but as you know, in Britain, you've got all sorts of conventions, you've got prerogative powers, and they're not really clearly defined, right? And so what a constitution will do is it will define what the role of government is by clarifying it within a constitution. So, for example, Tony Blair, for 10 years, he broke conventions. He broke constitutional conventions. He broke the idea of collective cabinet responsibility. Yet nothing happened to him, right? He did not have a single meeting where he had a vote on anything. So he was making every decision himself. It was what Lord, what's his name again? The elective dictatorship. Lord, oh, how could I have forgotten Lord Hailsham? Thank you, Sky. Oh, of course it's Sky. Lord Hailsham, the elective dictatorship, right? And look, and Sky, okay, I've got a bone to pick with you, Sky. You've just said Lord Hailsham in caps. I think caps are aggressive. And then you put a full stop after it. So you've basically given me two types of aggression. You're giving me, there was no need, Sky, for writing Lord Hailsham in caps. That's basically saying to me, you don't know Lord Hailsham. What's wrong with you? And I know Lord Hailsham. And then you've got a full stop after it. Amrin is right. Amrin is Caps is shouting. So is Sky shouting at me now? Not only is Charles unleashing a full stop against me, Sky is unleashing caps locks against me. So fair enough. All right. So yes, Blair broke cabinet government for 10 years and ran a yes. Sky, you're just triggering me now. Sky says sorry, and then she's put a whole load of punctuation after that sorry. That's triggering me. Is that the right word to use? It is triggering, right? You're triggering me. I don't know. Anyway, I should go on a protest. I should go on a protest and just put punctuation marks on my banner. Like I should write a banner just full of punctuation marks. Well, I should go on a student protest and do that, and everyone would just attack me and say, "How dare you?" Like I could be calling someone a Nazi, and that's not as bad as putting a question mark, a full stop, a semicolon. I think semicolons are evil, by the way, but that's a different discussion. Right. Yes. So never did Tony Blair have a vote, and that's what John Prescott, his deputy, said, right? The problem today is that the Constitution was designed to be applied by good chaps. All right, I love this point. So I'm going to make it, even though you're going to be sick of it by the end of component 2, or by the end of this series of sessions. There is a constitutional theorist called Peter Hennessy. Peter Hennessy is probably one of the most eminent constitutionalists in the country, right? And he's got this idea called the good chap doctrine, good chaps. And what he basically says is, in the old days, the government used to be full of good chaps. Now, I don't particularly buy this. I don't think we've really had good chaps in government. But anyway, he goes back to the old days, the days of Attlee and Churchill and people like that, who were honorable people. I don't really think they were that honorable. Sorry if that sounds controversial. There was a lot of, but then everyone has their context. Everyone has their bad days, right? Uh, so what Hennessy says is that in the old days, an uncodified constitution would be okay because it would be applied in a moderate way by good quality people, by good chaps. What he carries on saying, he's basically making the point, he's unleashing a question mark and a full stop against Boris Johnson here, because he's making the point that we no longer have good chaps. In other words, Boris Johnson, he's a rogue. And when he was prime minister, he would use every opportunity to subvert, to undermine the constitution, as he did when he closed down parliament, because he didn't want scrutiny of his Brexit negotiations, right? And so what Peter Hennessy argues is that we no longer have good chaps. And as a result of that, an uncodified constitution is being routinely abused, especially when it comes to the role and the limits of governmental power. For example, Johnson misinformed Parliament over parties at number 10, if you remember. He did not sack Priti Patel, who violated the ministerial code, for example, right? So Priti Patel, she violated the code that he had written, the code that said if a minister bullies, that minister no longer has the right to be a minister. When Priti Patel was actually found to have bullied she had to pay money to a civil servant because of bullying allegations. No longer allegations. She did bully. Boris Johnson did not sack her. And that's ultimately because these are conventions and not law. These are conventions and not statute. Johnson has, or had, I should say, rewritten the code to dilute the grounds of dismissal. And that's just a very lengthy point. We don't need to say that, to talk too much about that. So what we're saying here is that a lot of power in Britain comes down to the personal power and discretion of the prime minister, because none of that is really put into constitutional law. There isn't a law, a constitution which sets out the powers and the limits of the prime minister. A codified constitution would address this problem, like in the United States, where a lot of the powers and the roles of the president are laid out, right? In particular, the role of impeachment within the American system. Now, the counter argument to that is the current system allows for nimble government. Being nimble, you're allowed to do things quickly. Governments are not bound by old rules made a long time ago, but they can change and reform where necessary. So the 2010 reforms to the House of Commons, which I mentioned last week, the House of Lords Act, which revoked all but 92 peers in the House of Lords. You can say that, sorry, that should say Johnson. Even Johnson's, like even, Charles, what's your point about COVID? What's your point about COVID? Just clarify that point. I've written that in a convoluted way. We can create new ministries, for example. So, for example, during Brexit, a ministry was created for Brexit, or the Home Office was split into two. There is a lot of flexibility that the system allows government. In America, there is too much set in stone. Devolution is an example of that, right? In America, you can't change the relationship between the federal government and the states because that's been codified within a constitution. In Britain, we've got the slow and steady devolution. I talked about it yesterday. Metro mayors are gaining more and more powers, right? Yeah, I mean, that's the point there. The clarity in the US was not so. In the argument against the US's codified constitution is that there are still things in the constitution which aren't clear. Even in America, you can't be clear for all time and all places. Uh, so, for example, the filibuster, for those of you who study US politics, was introduced much later on, but it prevents uh, uh, passing much needed legislation in the United States, right? So the judgment here is that the problem remains that we have few good chaps in government, which has created real constitutional issues. I hope you get that. I hope that makes sense before we move on. Charles, the lack of codification allows for nimble government over COVID, as presumably things like devolution would be codified in the constitution, preventing an effective response. Yeah, that's not so bad, right? That's a good point. Although, I mean, I suppose a counter to that, Charles, is that, in a way, um, uh, devolution was not like changed. They didn't get rid of any devolved powers. Although it's true to say, at one stage, Boris Johnson was looking to overturn the devolved powers of Manchester, for example, because Manchester were refusing to lock down, and so there was a nuclear option to like take back powers. So that actually, your point is very valid. Your point about COVID is very valid. You could say that in an essay. At one point, because of an uncodified constitution and because of a global pandemic, the government was willing to reverse um, devolution for Manchester, because the Manchester mayor, Andy Burnham, did not want to lock down. Sky has now asked the Sky. I mean, are you like on a time lapse, Sky? Because I'm sure I mentioned this half an hour ago. Sky has now asked the question: why is a semicolon evil? Just look at it, Sky. Just look at a semicolon and tell me that's not evil. That's it. That's my evidence. My evidence is in plain sight. You know, just go to a Word document and type a semicolon, and come back to me and say, is that a marker of a rational, sane punctuation mark? No, I don't think it makes sense. Sky, you did not want to interrupt the conversation. Is that why you've raised it now? Okay, fair enough. That's a very honorable thing to do, Sky. But actually, Sky, there's a pun there, because isn't a semicolon actually used to not quite denote a full stop, but when there was a longer pause in a sentence, right? So when you don't want to interrupt the flow of a sentence, you put a semicolon in for a longer pause. So in a way, what you've just said there, Sky, is actually quite clever. I don't know if that was intentional, Sky, but that's a very clever, like, English grammar joke, Sky. All right. Parliament. Scrabble. I can't stand Scrabble. I just think it's an awful game. Right. So we're going to move on. I think we've done Constitution. So here's my summary. All of the essays we've looked at in Constitution, I feel, I'm not going to say, by the way, I'm convinced, definite, but I think you only really, if you cover the contents of those 4 or 5 essays, you will master most constitutional questions. I think 90% of Constitution is done. Yeah. I can't say for sure. You may get an odd question, which really is it's a googly question, as they say in cricket, a curveball. But that's life, right? You move on if you get one of those curveballs, or you dodge it, right?